Good morning, or hello, I should say. Hi, Chor. Am I pronouncing your name right? Hi, welcome. So you all voted. I love, by the way, following the polls every week to see, okay, which topic am I going to review this weekend? And it's really interesting to see people voting and what people want to review versus the topics that they don't really want to review, or maybe they want to review later. There seems to be a consensus that everybody needs some macroeconomics in their lives. So today's session I will use to review the first two macroeconomic objectives, the objectives of low unemployment and a low and stable inflation rate. So let's start with unemployment. Okay, let's first talk about what it means to be unemployed. To be unemployed is to be of working age. This is number one. To be actively looking for a job, but being unable to find a job. So to be unemployed, you need to be of working age, willing and able to work, actively seeking work, but unable to find work. There are four types of unemployment. So I'm going to use this quickly before I begin with the diagrams. So four types / causes of unemployment. All right, we've got structural, seasonal, frictional, and cyclical or demand deficient. All right, these three, structural, seasonal, and frictional, together make up what we call natural unemployment. Okay, which is basically the unemployment that exists when the economy is at full employment. Now, the good thing is structural unemployment has diagrams, and so does cyclical unemployment. It has diagrams. But seasonal and frictional, no diagrams. Okay, so I'm going to start with structural. All right, to understand the diagrams, you need to really understand what is structural unemployment. Structural unemployment exists when there is a mismatch between like the labor demand and the labor supply in the labor market. You'll notice, so let's have a look at this. Okay, let's assume there's a decrease in the demand for labor. And this is the price of labor, the wage rate, and the quantity of labor. Maybe this is the decrease of demand for labor in the restaurant industry, for example. So just in restaurants, okay? Maybe I should use it. So demand for labor in restaurant industry or hospitality industry, okay? Maybe because people aren't really going out to eat at restaurants as much. They don't feel safe. There's a pandemic, for example. Now, the problem is wages tend to get stuck. Ideally, if the wage could fall from W1 to W2, then it wouldn't be a problem. The market would reach a new equilibrium and there would be Q2 workers employed. However, the wages are stuck. So wages are stuck at W1 because in reality, wages tend to rise when there is inflation, but it's very rare that they fall when there is recession. Okay, now because the wages are stuck, now Q1 is the quantity supplied of restaurant workers, while Q3 is the quantity demanded. So there is now a surplus because of the fact that the labor market can't reach a new equilibrium. There's a surplus of unemployed workers. Okay, you'll notice here there's a mismatch between labor demand and labor supply due to falling demand for labor. Okay, this diagram is actually a microeconomic diagram because it's a diagram for just one labor market. It's not an aggregate demand or aggregate supply diagram. It's very important to remember this. Structural unemployment is when there's a mismatch between labor demand and labor supply in specific industries. Maybe due to falling demand for labor because maybe those industries are moving overseas, or there is technological change that is removing the need for workers or whatever. Okay, so this is one way to show structural unemployment when there is falling demand for labor. What are some of the reasons that there would be falling demand for labor? Well, it could be, for example, it could be that this industry is moving overseas, for example, where the cost of labor is cheaper. It could be that there is technological change that is replacing, so machines basically replacing workers, machines replacing workers, or whatever. The point is, this is a microeconomic diagram because it focuses on a specific labor market. Okay? We've just had about 4 more people join us. Feel free to say hello, introduce yourself, ask me questions as I'm going along. Okay, so this is one way to represent structural unemployment, which is caused by a falling demand for labor in specific industries or labor markets. Another way is also if the question has to do with minimum wage legislation. Sometimes the minimum wage itself and the activities of labor unions can lead to higher than equilibrium wages and lower quantity of labor. How do you know which diagram to use? Well, it depends on the question and the context, right? So falling demand for labor in specific industries can create structural unemployment. And minimum wage legislation and the activities of labor unions can also lead to structural unemployment. So let's assume, again, you've got price of labor, the wage on the y-axis, and quantity of labor, okay? Let's assume this is the demand for labor by, so this is from employers or businesses. And this is the supply of labor from the workers themselves, okay? The minimum wage leads to a higher than equilibrium wage, which is this one here, WM, the minimum wage. At WM, this is the quantity supplied by the workers. This is the number of workers who are available to work, but this is the quantity demanded, okay? The number of jobs available for them, the number of jobs available for them. So now there are more workers than there are jobs in this industry or in this labor market. Okay, there's a surplus of unemployed workers. These two diagrams can be used to represent structural unemployment depending on what is causing the structural unemployment. Is it minimum wage legislation or is it a falling demand for labor? Okay, that's how to know when to use which diagram. All right, now just because the minimum wage, I'd also like to say, and I don't want to get political or anything, but just because the minimum wage creates some form of unemployment doesn't mean we should get rid of the minimum wage. Because the minimum wage is not an efficiency driven policy, it's an equity driven policy. Okay, so yes, the minimum wage can sometimes create unemployment, but the solution is not to get rid of the minimum wage. The solution is to figure out a way to create more jobs, okay, and to retrain those workers so that they can move on to other industries or whatever, okay? I don't want you to think that because the minimum wage can sometimes create unemployment, that the minimum wage is a bad thing. No, it isn't. The minimum wage is designed to protect vulnerable members of our workforce. Okay, so sometimes structural unemployment due to labor market rigidities. Now, what is the effect of structural unemployment? So this is an effect of labor market rigidities, having things in the labor market that are preventing the market from reaching equilibrium. What that happens is it leads to an increase in the cost of production, and therefore the supply of the product, okay, shifts to the left. Okay, so here we're talking about the price of restaurant meals in general, right? And quantity of restaurant meals, not the workers. This is not a labor market diagram, it's just a product diagram. Chor just asked a question for the first structural graph. This one, yeah, could the supply line shift to the left instead of the demand line? Well, if there's a decrease in supply, that would actually make wages rise. So if you're saying that the supply shifts to the left, that would actually lead to a shortage of workers. That's not structural unemployment, sure. So if the supply shifts to the left, that's a decrease in the number of workers offering their labor. So it's actually that's a shortage of workers. There are more job vacancies than there are workers to fill them. Does that answer your question, Chor? Do you see how? Okay, I'm going to assume it has. Obviously, if you want me to clarify further, I'm more than happy to do that. So another thing that labor market rigidities do, like minimum wage legislation, like sticky wages that don't fall, all of this stuff, is it increases the costs of production for businesses. So what that does is a rise in the cost of production, supply shifts to the left, which leads to a fall in the quantity produced, which means employers hire fewer workers. So these are all diagrams that can be used to represent structural unemployment, depending on the question. Is what's driving, you can combine diagram A and diagram C, by the way. So say, for example, there's a rise in the cost of production, leading to a decrease in the demand for labor. You can combine these, okay? Or there's minimum wage legislation, which is making it difficult to clear this surplus of unemployed workers, which is raising the cost of production. So again, these are all diagrams. It says here that part A shows a labor market illustrating unemployment that arises from falling demand for labor in a particular industry or geographical area. While part B shows a labor market illustrating how unemployment can arise from a minimum wage. Part C shows a product market, not a labor market, illustrating the effect of labor market rigidities. So that's structural unemployment. What about cyclical unemployment? Remember, we said there are no diagrams for seasonal or frictional unemployment. The diagrams are only for structural and cyclical. Now, cyclical unemployment, you use a macroeconomic diagram, okay? Macroeconomic, the regular ADAS model. Cyclical unemployment is unemployment that is caused due to a decrease in aggregate demand, not the demand for a specific type of labor. That's structural unemployment. If there is a decrease in the demand for restaurant workers only, that's structural unemployment. But if there's a decrease in aggregate demand across the whole economy, that will create cyclical unemployment. So how do you represent this? Well, using the new classical model, there's a shift in AD to the left from AD1 to AD2, which basically creates a recessionary gap. So cyclical unemployment is the type of unemployment that exists during recessions or severe recessions like depressions, right? Because there's a decrease in aggregate demand, which is basically the same shift of AD to the left, whether it's the Keynesian model or the monetarist new classical model, okay? So remember, using the monetarist new classical model in part A and the Keynesian model in part B, this figure shows a deflationary gap or a recessionary gap, resulting in lower real GDP, which gives rise to cyclical unemployment. So cyclical unemployment is represented using a macroeconomic ADAS model, while structural unemployment is represented using labor market diagrams. This distinction is very important. All right. Now, let's move on. So this is unemployment, okay? Now, actually, before I move on to inflation, let's talk about some of the policies that the government can use. Structural unemployment requires supply-side policies, okay? Structural unemployment requires things like maybe subsidizing those industries where there is a fall in demand for labor to lower their costs, or maybe lowering the minimum wage, or maybe investing in education to retrain workers, retraining programs. The point is, structural, seasonal, and frictional unemployment is best addressed using supply-side policies. Cyclical unemployment is best addressed using expansionary demand-side policies. So either the government will use expansionary fiscal policy to increase government spending and lower taxes, or expansionary monetary policy, lower interest rates and increase the supply of money, all of which is designed to increase aggregate demand across the whole economy. Okay? So remember, structural, seasonal, and frictional unemployment is best addressed using supply side policies. Cyclical unemployment is best addressed using demand side policies. What about inflation? Well, there are two types of inflation. There is demand pull inflation and cost push inflation. The diagram for demand pull inflation is the opposite of the diagram for cyclical unemployment. So remember, a decrease in aggregate demand creates a recessionary gap, right? And therefore, that means there will be workers that are cyclically unemployed. Okay? Demand pull inflation is the opposite. It's when there's an increase in aggregate demand beyond full employment. Okay? An increase in aggregate demand beyond full employment creates what we call an inflationary gap. Okay? So, cyclical unemployment exists in a recessionary gap, while demand pull inflation exists in an inflationary gap. Okay, it's the opposite of cyclical unemployment. So, an increase in aggregate demand will, beyond the full employment level of output, will create demand pull inflation. Okay, you can see that when there's an increase in aggregate demand, output goes beyond full employment level of output. So you can see YINFL is greater than YP, the potential output or the full employment level of output, and the price level rises from PL1 to PL2. The same with the Keynesian model. Okay. Now, cost push inflation, on the other hand, is caused. So cost push inflation is caused by an increase in the costs of production, not in a specific industry, but across the whole economy. Okay, maybe there is a war like what's happening between Russia and Ukraine right now that's raising gas prices. When gas prices rise, because all businesses need gas and they need fuel, right? This raises the cost of production across the entire economy. So how do you represent this? By a decrease in SRES, a shift in SRES to the left. Okay, so represented diagrammatically by a leftward shift of SRES. Okay, this creates stagflation, what we call stagflation. There is both a recession because there's a decrease in output from YP to YRC, plus inflation because there's an increase in the cost of production, a decrease in SRES, a shift to the left. Okay, so this figure shows how a fall in SRS gives rise to a higher price level and lower real GDP. This is cost push inflation. Okay, so that's inflation. Let me first define inflation. I should have done this before I talked about demand pull and cost push inflation. Inflation is basically a persistent rise in the average price level. Okay, so inflation is a persistent, not a one-time rise, a persistent or sustained rise in the average price level over a period of time. Before I move on to deflation, I want to talk about disinflation. Disinflation is a slowing down of the inflation rate, which means the inflation rate is still positive, but it's slowing down. Okay? Deflation, on the other hand, is a persistent or sustained fall in the average price level over a period of time. Deflation, the inflation rate is negative, while inflation and disinflation, the inflation rate is positive, above zero. Here, the deflation rate is negative, below zero. Okay, so what are the causes of deflation? Well, there is good deflation, which is caused by an increase in SRAS. Okay, this is actually a positive supply shock. This is what we call good deflation. And there is bad deflation, which is caused by a decrease in aggregate demand. Okay, so deflation caused by an increase in the short run aggregate supply isn't very alarming. This is because the economy is becoming more efficient and costs of production are falling. That's not alarming. Could be because of there's a discovery of new revolutionary technology. Okay. Well, deflation caused by a fall in aggregate demand is actually very alarming because once people start to expect deflation, they stop buying things. They stop buying cars, houses. Why? Because they expect prices will keep falling. The problem is it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? For when people stop buying things over time, aggregate demand keeps decreasing, businesses declare bankruptcy, more workers are fired, which leads to more deflation, and then it just becomes this deflationary spiral, right? But basically, deflation may arise from a fall in aggregate demand, which is bad deflation, or an increase in SRAS, which is a positive supply shock. It's good deflation, not very alarming. Okay, are there any questions about inflation and deflation before I continue? Because the next section is for higher level students. Sure, yes, consumer confidence decreases when basically that decrease in consumer confidence, yes, consumer confidence decreases, which will lead, that will actually be the cause behind the decrease in aggregate demand. Because remember, consumer confidence is one of the determinants of consumption, and consumption is one of the components of aggregate demand. So yes, consumer confidence decreasing could drive the initial fall in aggregate demand that then causes deflation. However, as deflation continues, consumer confidence keeps falling, keeps decreasing. Does that make sense? So it could be the initial cause of the decrease in aggregate demand, but it could also drive further and further causes of the fall in aggregate demand. Okay? Sure. Are you high level or standard level? I'll give you a minute to respond. Sure. Are you higher level or standard level? Because the next section is about the Phillips curve, which is a higher level concept. Okay, perfect. Well, sure, you're in. Today's your lucky day because I'm going to also talk about the Phillips curve. Okay, the Phillips curve is, I'm just going to write here, HL only. So if you are an SL student, you're more than welcome to stay, by the way, if you want to learn, and develop your breadth of knowledge. But if it's going to confuse you, you don't need to be here because the Phillips curve is only for HL students. So the Phillips curve is basically a curve that tracks the relationship between the inflation rate, which is a percentage, on the y-axis, and the unemployment rate, which is also a percentage on the x-axis. Okay? And we see, Fiona, you're welcome. Have a great one. I think she already left. I know Fiona is a standard level student. All right. So when economists track the relationship between inflation and unemployment, generally, but not always, remember this. Generally, but not always, there's a trade-off between inflation and unemployment. Okay? You can see here, when you move from point A to point B, the unemployment rate is falling, but the inflation rate is rising. The same with point B to point C. The same with point C to point D. And in the opposite direction as well. When you move from point D to point C, the inflation rate is falling and the unemployment rate is rising, and so on. Okay? So generally, but not always, the short run Phillips curve shows a trade-off between inflation and unemployment. Let's connect that with the ADAS model. So basically, if there's an increase in aggregate demand from AD1 to AD2, okay? The economy moves from point A to point B, the average price level rises. However, this creates an inflationary gap, which means because there's an increase in aggregate demand, there's economic growth in the short term, there are more jobs being created, which means there's a decline in the unemployment rate. So as you can see here, when the economy was at point A and it moved to point B, the unemployment rate fell. Sorry about that. The unemployment rate fell while the inflation rate rose. Okay? And the same with moving from point B to point C. Again, there's a further increase in aggregate demand, which created more of an inflationary gap. So the unemployment rate continued falling and the inflation rate rose. And as well, from point C to point D. And the opposite is true. Moving from point D to point C, there's a decrease in aggregate demand. A decrease in aggregate demand creates cyclical unemployment, which means the unemployment rate increases while the inflation rate falls. Okay? So this is the relationship between these points and these points. Okay? Point A, there's high unemployment and low inflation. Point B, there's a fall in unemployment but higher inflation. Point B to point C, there's a fall in unemployment and even higher inflation. Point C to point D, a further fall in unemployment and even higher inflation. Okay? So, remember, as you go up the Phillips curve, there is demand pull inflation and lower cyclical unemployment. As you move down the Phillips curve, there is higher cyclical unemployment and lower demand pull inflation. That's the idea. The real trade-off is between cyclical unemployment and demand pull inflation. Well, what about the other types of unemployment and the other types of inflation? These are represented differently. So let's have a look at the new classical model. Okay? Let's assume consumer confidence rises, so aggregate demand increases from AD1 to AD2. This moves the economy from point A to point B. Now the economy is experiencing a lower rate of unemployment from 5% to 3% and a higher rate of inflation from 5% to 7%. Okay? What's going to happen if there is no government intervention? In the long run, the average price level will rise because of this inflation rate. Workers will start demanding higher wages. When workers start demanding higher wages, this raises the costs of production in the economy, which decreases short-run aggregate supply from point B to point C, bringing the economy back to full employment. You can see now point B and point C are on different SRPC curves. Okay? Because the economy has returned back to its natural rate of unemployment, which is 5%. 5% is basically the NRU in this economy, natural rate of unemployment. This is the unemployment that would exist only when there is structural plus seasonal plus frictional unemployment, which means cyclical unemployment is zero. Zero cyclical unemployment. Okay? So, a decrease in short-run aggregate supply and a shift to the left, so decrease, leftward shift in SRES is represented by a rightward shift of the short-run Phillips curve. And the long-run Phillips curve is vertical at the natural rate of unemployment. What is the natural rate of unemployment? It is the amount of unemployment that exists when the economy is producing its full employment level of output, YP, where only structural, seasonal, and frictional unemployment exists. There is zero cyclical unemployment. So remember, YP, level of output, where cyclical unemployment is zero. That means there is only the natural rate of unemployment. Okay, that's the LRPC. Okay, here we assume there was no government intervention, by the way. We're just talking about the automatic adjustment of the economy from long run to short run macroeconomic equilibrium. Okay, so you can see here, part A shows two short-run Phillips curves here, together with a long-run Phillips curve that is vertical at the natural rate of unemployment. Part B uses the ADS model to explain why the LRPC Phillips curve is vertical at the natural rate of unemployment. Because according to new classical economists, the economy will always gravitate towards full employment. The natural rate of unemployment is basically the center of gravity of unemployment. Whenever there is cyclical unemployment, new classical economists assume that it will sort itself out. Okay, that's why new classical economists argue against government intervention. Sure, that's a very good question. Can this be shown using the Keynesian model? No. Why? Because in the Keynesian model cannot show cost push inflation or a decrease in SRES, and the Keynesian model does not believe in automatic adjustment. The Phillips curve is very much a monetarist and new classical concept. Just like the Keynesian multiplier is a Keynesian concept. So no, you cannot represent this automatic adjustment using a Keynesian model. If you are going to be talking about the Phillips curve in your exam, you need to make sure you are using the new classical model. Sure, that's a very good question. All right, I have finished what I had planned. I was basically just going to do a quick review of the main diagrams and concepts in unemployment and inflation and talk about the trade-off between both. Are there any further questions before I dismiss you all? I feel like you're all sitting in class. You're welcome, Chor. Thank you for joining, and I'd love to see you same time next week. Hopefully, I mean, unless there's an emergency or I can't attend for whatever reason, and I will post in the communities tab, by the way. Yes, Chor, every week at the same time, Chor, and I want you to tell all of your classmates. And I would encourage you, Chor, if you're not yet, to become a member of the channel. All the links to support the channel are in the description below, by the way. Become a member. There's a lot of exclusive content, a lot of more perks just for members. There's about 20 videos behind the subscription channel that's just for members. These include paper 1, paper 2, and paper 3 questions, videos showing real-world examples, the entire development economics unit. To answer your question, Chor, yes, I'm going to continue this every week at the same time, and I'm going to review a different topic every week. You can find the voting, the polls, for what topic to cover in the community section. So, Chor, yeah, definitely. You can come every week at the same time. Chor, which part of the world are you in? Which time zone? You don't have to tell me the exact city, but at least country. Yeah, Chor, definitely subscribe, but also look into becoming a member, not just subscribing, because becoming a member also gives you further perks that are not open to just subscribers. So keep this in mind. Okay. Time zone 2. So I'm guessing you're in the southern hemisphere. What country are you in? If you don't mind me asking. I don't need to know the city. Sure. What country are you in? Okay. Okay, UAE. Oh, I worked in the UAE for 2 years. I lived in Dubai between 2014 and 2016. Sure, welcome. Please tell your classmates every week at the same time. Tell them to come, join, bring their questions. Tell them to check the communities tab. I know that the chat lags. That's just a feature on YouTube. So sure, I want you to tell all your classmates every week at the same time. I'm going to be reviewing a different part of the syllabus all the way until your May 22 exams. And this is really because I want to help people pass their exams. And it's good marketing and promotion for my channel as well. So sure, it's great to meet you. Welcome. I'm so glad that you joined us. You had very good questions. Do you have any other questions for me, Chor, before I end this live stream? Because I finished what I wanted to cover. And obviously, you can also think about what topics you want to see next week. You can make requests. So right now, I'm glad, sure. Thank you. And if you have any requests, you can obviously leave a comment on any video. I respond to all my comments, or leave a comment now while I'm wrapping up. Leave a comment now of whatever topic you want me to cover next week at the same time, and try to bring some of your classmates too. Everyone else who joined, it's been great having you all. Thank you, Fiona, even though she's not here because she's SL and she left towards the end. Um, if you want to support the channel, there are several ways you can do that. You can become a subscriber, you can like, you can comment, you can become a member. Becoming a member costs you the same as what a cup of coffee will cost you, but it gives you access to all these exclusive perks. You can also buy me a coffee. There's a link to something called Buy Me a Coffee, which is like Patreon, down in the description below. I am really glad to be helping you all prepare for your mock exams and your final IB exams. Again, as I said, you can leave comments on any of my videos if you are requesting specific topics for live streams. And today we reviewed low unemployment and low and stable rate of inflation as two of the government macroeconomic objectives. Have a great weekend. Have a great rest of your week. And I will see you next week at the same time. Bye. Bye, Chor. You're welcome. Absolutely. Absolutely. You're welcome. Yep.